We now turn our attention to the shifting currents of global geopolitics and India's growing influence on the world stage. From Indo-Pacific to multilateral forums, from critical technology alliances to defense cooperation, India is playing an increasingly central role in shaping the global order. This session will examine the strategic and diplomatic dimensions of this rise and how India's global positioning intersects with regional security, economic diplomacy, and greater power competition. We are honored to have with us Mr. Sadanand Dhume to chair this important panel. Sadanand Dhume is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a renowned columnist at the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Dhume brings sharp analysis and deep contextual understanding of the South Asian politics and global affairs. He's joined today by two leading thinkers in foreign policy and security, Ms. Lisa Curtis, Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Society, and Dr. Tanvi Madan, Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. We look forward to this rich discussion. Over to you, Sadanand.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? So, when I first heard of the topic of this panel, geopolitics in flux, I was very happy because it's such a broad, expansive panel. You could, topic title that you could just, put virtually anything into it. And then, of course, the tragic events of the last few weeks unfolded, and we have probably a much more sharply focused discussion than we would have if we'd had this discussion, say, a month ago. So we have two fantastic speakers over here. Those of you who are familiar with the U.S.-India space are obviously familiar with both Lisa and with Tanvi. I won't get into long bios, but I just suffice to say that Lisa has been involved with India and Pakistan from a U.S. government perspective for a long time. This is not the first crisis that she's aware of. She's been on the ground going back 25 years and longer. And right now she's with the Center for New American Security. Tanvi, of course, is at the Brookings Institution. You're aware of her writing. You're aware of her book on US, India, and China, and obviously her numerous television and other appearances. So the way we're going to do this today is that we're going to keep this conversational and then leave a little space at the end for your questions, and I'm sure you're going to have questions. So let me start with asking Lisa a question. Lisa, if you had to just explain what has happened over the last few weeks to somebody who was waking up right now from a coma, how would you lay it out?
Okay, thank you, Sadanand. It's great to be here. The current India-Pakistan crisis or conflict, we've now entered the conflict stage, actually started on April 22nd with a horrific terrorist attack against civilian, mostly tourists. 26 people were killed, 25 Indian, 1 Nepali. They were separated out and identified by religion. They were targeting Hindus, and they were shot and killed in front of family members, in front of wives, children. So it was an absolutely horrific scene in Pahalgam, Kashmir on that day. So India has retaliated. Exactly 2 weeks later, India retaliated against terrorist infrastructure inside Pakistan, both in Pakistani Kashmir, but also in the Punjab, which is very significant. This is the heart of Pakistan, where India retaliated. It retaliated at places like Bahawalpur, which is the headquarters for the U.S. designated terrorist group Jaish-e-Mohammed. It retaliated in Muridke, where you have the headquarters for Lashkar-e-Taiba, also a U.S. designated terrorist organization. Now, Pakistan claimed that it shot down 5 Indian aircraft after this Indian retaliation. We haven't heard from India on this. We have heard from the French that at least one Rafale plane was shot down. So I think, we can assume that at least one, if not a few, Indian aircraft were shot down. Many of us thought on Wednesday, after the Indian retaliation, Pakistan's report that it had shot down Indian aircraft, that we had an opportunity to de-escalate the crisis and walk down the escalation ladder. However, that's not what happened. What we saw on Wednesday night was a lot of activity. India claims that Pakistani missiles and drones attempted to hit many Indian military installations. India responded with apparent drone strikes and other strikes against Pakistan's air defenses. Thursday, I think it was a very unclear day. That, I think we can say the fog of war has set in, where there's a lot of activity happening on both sides of the line of control as well as both sides of the border. It's an alarming situation. It's a very dangerous situation. As Sadanand indicated, I have been through many India-Pakistan crises. During the 1999 Kargil conflict, I was an analyst at the CIA. During the 2001-2002 military buildup, I was at the State Department. And during the 2019 Balakot crisis, I was at the National Security Council. So I have seen how these things happen. And, once the crises start, it is really imperative that the United States is helping the two countries to back away from the brink of an all-out war. It's extremely important. I have watched the U.S. play this role. It's always necessary, and I, think that in this crisis, it's no different, that this is very important for the U.S. to be working the phones, talking to both sides, and, talking them both off the cliff.
Tanvi, how would you say the current crisis, in your view, looks different from previous iterations of India-Pakistan crisis?
So I think there's a couple of things there, right? I mean, on the one hand, you see it almost in the same path of the last couple of crises we've seen in 2016 and 2019. But if you look at what we'd seen in the crises before, I'm setting aside 1999 because that didn't involve terrorist attack, that involved military personnel from Pakistan going over or attempting to go over across the border into India. But in 2001-2, during the attack on the Indian Parliament, and 2008 with the Mumbai attacks, where terrorist groups based in Pakistan were involved, what you saw was a couple of things. One, on the kind of Indian side, but second, on the kind of how the US, it also reflected how the US used to handle those crises and their relationships. The US relationship with India and Pakistan were quite different in at least a couple of ways then. I think in those crises, what you saw is, while India mobilized forces in 2001 for a considerable period of time on both sides, there was deployments. What you saw is India show restraint, not kind of react or retaliate militarily. Same thing in 2008. Considerable amount of restraints shown by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, praised by international observers for it, now criticized in India for that restraint. But nonetheless, especially just a few months before an election, not military retaliation. And the reason he's often praised is that next year you saw India grow at 9-10%. So that link with that there are larger things at play here for India as well. But what you saw, I think, after that in 2016, and in both those cases, partly because the US was involved in Afghanistan militarily, needed Pakistan in a different way, so Pakistan's utility for the US was different. You had the Bush administration counsel restraint on both sides, and there was a lot of shuttle diplomacy involved. I think what you saw in 2016 and 2019 was different. It wasn't that this was the first crisis in the Modi
Walk them
government.
through what happened in
Yeah.
2016 and 2019, because everyone may not be aware.
Sure. So it wasn't the first terrorist attack on Indian personnel or Indian citizens during the new Modi government that had gone into place in 2014. There was another one in 2015. But in 2016, what you ended up seeing is an attack on military personnel, Indian military personnel. Pakistani-based terrorist group took credit for it. And you saw India conduct what it described as surgical strikes. So a few kind of soldiers who took action across the line of control that separates the Indian parts of Kashmir and the Pakistan parts. What you saw in 2019, which is when you saw another attack on Indian personnel, is India strike with aircraft, and not just across the line of control, but across the international border. The other thing that you saw different in these two cases was the US government not call for Indian restraint after the attack and not criticize those Indian strikes. Both the Obama administration and the first Trump term, Lisa was actively involved in the decision. But nonetheless, also after those strikes, call for de-escalation once those strikes were complete. I think what you're seeing that is different, there's a range of things that's different this time, including how the US is approaching this currently. But just on kind of what India's action has entailed, there are a couple of things different. One, you saw after the terrorist attack, it was on civilians. I think it's important to say those two crises previously were on military personnel. This was on civilians. This was, as Lisa pointed out, targeted by religion. There were also people this is the worst civilian attack on Indian civilians since the Mumbai attacks in 2008. And you also saw the victims were from over a dozen Indian states, so national residents even beyond Kashmir. Just a couple of other points just quickly that make this, I think, moment different is you saw in this case a group called the Resistance Front that India links with the designated terrorist group Lashkar-e-Taiba, first take credit and then kind of withdraw that claim. In 2019, the group Jaish-e-Mohammed took credit for it very quickly. So what you've seen, I think that is one difference, which is why you've seen a number of statements, including from the US, not actually till recently, you've seen a number of international statements condemn the attacks, not criticize Indian strikes, but also not draw a direct line to Pakistan just yet. I think some recent American statements have at least generally talked about Pakistani-based terrorist groups. I think the second, and that's the last point I'll make, is that's different is it's clear in the Indian military retaliation, as Lisa pointed out, they didn't just, they wanted to go beyond just kind of what they did in 2019, which is attack some terrorist infrastructure. We have their doubts about what was hit, etc. I won't go into that. But nonetheless, what you saw is many more locations targeted, explicitly saying it's terrorist-based infrastructure, and secondly, the strikes in Punjab, which was different.
So Lisa, as Tanvi pointed out, there's been a kind of pattern shift in terms of how the U.S. acts, right? So 99 onwards, basically, Pakistan would commit an atrocity, and India would be advised restraint. From 2016 onwards, it's been Pakistan commits an atrocity, India responds, and then the U.S. counsels restraint. So the point of counsel comes later. But this time, we have a U.S. administration where the vice president just said that, well, this is really not something for us to get involved in. Of course, the Secretary of State has spoken with the Indian foreign minister and the Pakistani prime minister, and he's tweeted about it also. But we are at a moment in the U.S. where at least a significant number of supporters of the current administration feel that the U.S. has kind of been over-involved, overextended in all the world's problems. We don't have to be involved in everything. How do you see that kind of mood, which you and I may not agree with, but that exists? How do you see that affecting the current crisis potentially?
Well, I think that is how people are interpreting particularly Vice President Vance's recent comments that, the U.S. can't control this, we're not going to get deeply involved. I think people are seeing that as perhaps this administration, is not going to take the U.S. traditional role. of getting involved, quietly talking to both sides, counseling restraint, trying to prevent a conflict that could potentially go nuclear. And I think that would be a mistake. I think that would be a grave error if indeed, the U.S. was to take a sort of stand back policy, because this is a dangerous situation. Anytime that there's a conflict between two nuclear armed states that have gone to war in the past, there's been 3 major wars, 1 major border conflict between these two countries. So I think it would be a mistake if that was the thinking. But like you said, we've heard a different message from Secretary of State Rubio, who has been very clear that he's been on the phone, he's been talking with the Indian foreign minister on several occasions, he's talked with the Pakistani prime minister as well as the deputy prime minister and foreign minister in Pakistan. And I think this is good. I think, it is the right thing to try to be providing ways that the two countries can find a face-saving way out, and using that influence that the U.S. has. It's great. Saudi Arabia is involved. I think the Iranian foreign minister has tried to get involved in these de-escalation efforts. But when it comes down to it, the U.S., the most powerful powerful country in the world, that's the most important country to be involved. And I think there is still a role. But I do think it's important for Secretary of State Rubio to also engage with Chief of Army Staff Asim Munir, because at this point in the conflict, Pakistan has been de-escalating in the last 36, 48 hours, and he is the one who is directing these military operations. Escalating. Yeah, I'm sorry, did I say D? Yes. I meant escalating. Pakistan has been escalating the crisis in the last 36 hours. So it is the Chief of Army Staff, Asim Munir, who is directing these military operations. So I think it's important for Secretary of State Rubio to get on the phone with him. In India, you have a civilian-led military, so it's fine to be engaging with the civilian leadership in India. But in Pakistan, you've got to engage with the military leadership because they're the ones in control. They're the ones that are driving the Pakistani response.
Tanvi, we've over the years we've kind of learned so much about different military chiefs in Pakistan. I think one of the most interesting contrasts between India and Pakistan is that we kind of know virtually nothing about whoever becomes the chief of the Indian Army, whereas in Pakistan, the army chief is obviously the most important actor in that country. But Asim Munir was a relatively unknown person when he rose to this position. What's your best read of what he's like and what that means for this crisis?
I will caveat this with, I am not an expert on the Pakistani military. There's several people and several good academics who have done great work on the Pakistani military. There are people like Aisha Siddiqa, who wrote a great piece in the Financial Times just recently on exactly that question, the domestic dynamics. I will say, just kind of from the perspective of him and the crisis, I think he's in some ways the known unknown. A person who is not like we know enough to know he's not like the previous Pakistani Army Chief, General Bajwa, who was, and maybe Lisa has thoughts on that, was there during the previous crisis and did take that exit ramp, so to speak, that was presented then. What we do know another thing we know about General Munir is that he is considered to be more aggressive, more of a true believer. And also he's in a slightly different circumstance and context where you have seen the Pakistani military's reputation within Pakistan take some hits, in part because of the nature of their involvement in Pakistani politics, particularly the detention of former Prime Minister Imran Khan. And you come at a context where either the pressure is, you see this as a time that you're feeling under pressure to do more, to show that this is why the Pakistani military is relevant, still essential, still the reason that you need a big chunk of the Pakistani defense or the budget as a whole for the military. Or you see it as an opportunity to actually say, so it's not so much you're on the defensive, that you go on the offensive, saying this is an opportunity for me to actually show that the Pakistani military is, actively involved and can defend its borders. So I think the things we do know about General Munir is that he is different from his predecessor, and we don't know whether he's going to be willing to take the exit ramps that might present themselves. He hasn't taken them thus far, and I feel like there have been at least a couple of other windows. The other thing I'll just say is part of whether it was connected or not, but at least there was a coincidence that just a few days before the April 22nd attack, which had these communal dimensions, General Munir gave a pretty inflammatory speech, talking about not just Kashmir as Pakistan's jugular vein, but talking about kind of the Hindu-Muslim divide as being kind of really crucial, and in some other inflammatory ways, which I won't repeat. But nonetheless, so that I think forms the context as well of how he is potentially seen and what his belief system is.
Lisa,
Can I add one point on that? Because I think Tanvi is absolutely right that Asim Munir does seem to be more of a hawk on India than General Bajwa was. But I will say that General Munir is very interested in improving the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. He has shown a great deal of interest in having better relations with the United States. And so this is a card that the U.S. can now play because there were tentative steps being made toward improving the relationship with Pakistan. We saw President Trump in his address to Congress thank Pakistan for its help in extraditing one of the perpetrators in the August 26, 2021 attack in Kabul. We know that Pakistan held a critical minerals conference a couple weeks ago. A senior State Department official attended that. So there were these tentative steps toward improving the relationship. And I think that's something that now somebody like Secretary of State Rubio could hold out, that, look, there is room to improve this relationship. But, number one, you need to de-escalate this current crisis. And number two, you need to make sure that terrorists are not operating freely on your territory.
so that's actually partly answers my question, but I'm going to ask it in any case. The way I see it, one of the reasons why it was relatively easy to de-escalate in 2019, a couple of reasons. The first is that there were widely different claims on what exactly happened when India struck the terrorist camp in Balakot in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. The Indian media claimed that India had killed large numbers of terrorists. The international media and the Pakistani media basically said that India hit a tree. Then you had the sort of tit for tat, and an Indian jet was down, and a pilot was captured, and the Pakistanis returned them. But I think what happened was that the way the dynamic was in 2019 was that both countries could declare victory, and in fact, both countries did declare victory to their own people. This situation is very different, right? The Pakistanis have acknowledged that at least 31 people have been killed in Indian strikes. The strikes, as Tanvi also mentioned and you mentioned, the political significance and the social and cultural significance of India, in fact, hitting places like Muridke and Bahawalpur, which basically, let's face it, for decades have existed under the patronage of the Pakistani army. These are like absolutely some of the safest places in the world to be if you were a terrorist. And the fact that the Indians have attacked these with missiles, it makes Asim Munir's domestic situation more precarious. And I'll add to that the fact that I think the Indians want an off-ramp, and I think the Indians have wanted an off-ramp from the start. If you see their statement after the first strikes, they were sort of basically trying to signal that we're done now, we've retaliated, we can end this right now. But I don't think the Indians want this to end in terms where the Pakistanis could claim, as in 2019, that they had scored a victory too. So given the complexity of this, you have at least one card that the US has over here, which is that Pakistan wants to improve its ties with the US. But if you were advising Secretary of State Rubio at this moment, what other cards would you be saying? What else do you think could be done to prevent Pakistan from escalating further? And it looks very likely to me at this moment that they will in fact escalate. And then Tanvi, if you could add to the same question after Lisa.
Well, I think, again, you have the terrorist problem in Pakistan. You know, we should all be asking how, you know, in the year 2025, are U.S. designated terrorist groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed still around? Why is LET leader Hafiz Mohammed Saeed still only in under house arrest? Why isn't he in a proper jail? You know, I think all of these questions need to be asked. And, you know, Pakistan in the past has been on the gray list of the Financial Action Task Force for its support to these groups. So that is another mechanism where action could be initiated. Of course, there's the UN, where in 2019, the U.S. worked very hard to ensure that Jaish-e-Mohammed leader Masood Azhar was designated as a terrorist. The U.S. had been pursuing that effort for a long time, but it had been blocked by China for many years. So I think, you know, really making the point to Pakistan about, you know, the fact that it can no longer support these terrorist groups. You know, it's very telling that the strike in Bahawalpur actually ended up killing terrorist Abdur Rauf Azhar, who is the brother of Masood Azhar. And he was involved, Abdur Rauf Azhar was involved in the brutal and heinous kidnapping and killing of the Wall Street Journal reporter Danny Pearl in 2002. So it took 23 years, but finally justice was served for that terrorist act. So the question has to be asked, why couldn't Pakistan take action against this brutal terrorist? So this is a problem. And, you know, I think this is has to be dealt with. Right now we're trying to get the two countries to step back from an all-out war. But, you know, when the situation calms down, I think people are going to be asking questions about the, you know, the terrorists who are still operating freely inside Pakistan.
Tanvi, same question to you. If you had a 5-minute phone call with the Secretary of State or a 5-minute meeting, what would you ask him to do?
So I'm going to answer this in a different way because I think Lisa has covered, you know, there are things like the Financial Action Task Force, the Pakistani military gets a good chunk of IMET, this international military training, education and training program. There are both carrots and sticks that the US has, but there's a different dimension. And I will say, you know, when Lisa talked about the importance of the US approach to this, in previous crises, both sides in different ways almost expect intervention to come in so that they don't go up a certain escalation ladder. India doesn't like mediation. Pakistan wants mediation, but nonetheless, both almost expect and sometimes want some kind of intervention to help them take those, or at least to shine a light, so to speak, on where the exit ramps are, or highlight them. I think they can also help with narrative shaping in some ways, though both governments, I think, also have an ability to shape a narrative about what wins and losses are. But I think there's a different dimension to this as well. The US is not the only actor here, or particularly one that if we're talking about, you know, who's going to shine a spotlight on the exit ramp for General Munir, there are other actors involved here. Partners of Pakistan like the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Chinese. The British government has links with the Pakistani military as well. And so part of it, and I'm sure Lisa did this when she was, is coordination with some of these actors. Now, way back when, in 1999, 2008, there was US-China coordination. US-China relations not in the same place, but nonetheless, you can actually still have certain conversations because while the Chinese have been very supportive of the Pakistanis, tried to dissuade an Indian military strike, criticized the Indian military strike, their next statement after calling the Indian military strike regrettable, they're one of only 2 countries that have criticized India. What they did say is, we counsel calm and restraint and are willing to work with others to coordinate. Now, they are not quite an honest broker. They are a party that's supplying one, but they also have leverage and do not want to see the situation. Same with the Saudis in UAE and Qatar. These countries earlier were seen as Pakistani partners, but they also today have an interest in India in a way, in the Indian economy, in Indian kind of strategic ties with this India, where they have a different view of this. They have, again, had a similar statement about de-escalation, but not criticizing it. So I think it is about bringing in these other countries and seeing what that kind of leverage. Final thing I'll say is, we talk about this as perhaps the potential for escalation is limitless. I don't think that's necessarily true, right? In the sense that these are both rational actors on both sides. And one of the things that General Munir even will be, or at least people around him will be aware of, are certain kind of just resource limitations. Pakistan doesn't have an endless supply of military equipment or spares or servicing for material. You need, when you're fighting conflicts, you need to have an economy that can help you in stores of food and energy and those kind of things. Sadanand, you wrote a column recently in the journal, right? Pointing out the capabilities gap, and maybe you want to say something about that, is just even whatever the conventional military balance, etc., there are some limits on kind of the ability, frankly, of both sides to some extent, but particularly of Pakistan, without that support. And if those countries that is expecting support from say to Pakistan, you need to de-escalate this, they will have to listen.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share a couple of very quick statistics from my column. India's population is about 6 times as large as Pakistan's, but India's economy is 11 times as large. The Indian defense budget is about 86 billion. The Pakistani defense budget is $10 billion. One Indian company, Reliance Industries, has a market capitalization that is more than 4 times larger than the entire Pakistan Stock Exchange. So the economic mismatch is massive, which actually is a good way. Tanvi, let me stick with you and just to broaden this, right? So all 3 of us were at this technology summit in Delhi a few weeks ago, and this is of course before the massacre. Left to itself, India has a lot going on, and there's a lot of other things that it's interested in. It would like the Pakistan problem to just go away. But that's just not how the world works. But if you could just, Tanvi, step back for a moment and put yourself in the shoes now of a decision maker in New Delhi. You've got this problem, you have the political pressure that arises to do something, but you've also got the fact that, India will be the 3rd largest economy in the world in a few years. It has very different stakes. So how would you be looking at it if you're sort of, looking at this as an Indian decision maker right now?
I mean, I think you've kind of provided the gist of it. It's just one, and I think this is the reason you have seen Indian officials say repeatedly, we have a commitment to non-escalation unless the other side, if they respond, we will retaliate in the same domain, is how they put it. But part of it is, for India, there's a kind of a negative and a positive aspect. Well, positive is you have a lot other things going on. You have an economy that's one of the fastest growing major economies in the world. You have partnerships that you want to deepen, both for strategic purposes, but also, as the first panel discussed, for economic reasons. You want to attract investment. You don't want to be rehyphenated as part of like the most dangerous place in the world again. You want to say you're open for business. India, a few hours, I think it was before the military strike, signed a trade agreement with the UK. They're in the middle of negotiating one with the US and with the European Union. So wanting to stay on track, needing to have job-creating growth, skill, a number of people, create about 8 million jobs a year, that's what India, will be keeping an eye on. You do not want to get derailed from that broader strategic objective. That's the positive. There's some other aspects. India's got a China border that has been was in crisis in 2020. They redeployed, in fact, troops from the Pakistan border. to the China border. China being Pakistan's closest friend, it's not that that they have not tended to militarily intervene in previous India-Pakistan, but they have been helpful to the Pakistanis at time, or at the very least, India has to think about that border. Its military modernization, everything was directed about thinking about China as India's strategic rival. But that, in India's mind, has always been linked to China-Pakistan rivalry. So India does have to also. The other thing, just on the, we were just talking about restraints. India has a better defense industrial base than it used to. It's producing more munitions at home. It probably has more stores, partly because it's been thinking about a China crisis. But at the end of the day, who have India's suppliers been? It's been Israel. It's been Russia. It's even been Ukraine. Let's just say those defense industrial bases are focused on other things right now. So even India has to think about these other things, and at the end of the day, wants to stay on track to where it was going, becoming a pole in the multipolar world, as it put it, or having an economy that's creating those 8 million jobs a year.
Lisa, keeping it broader than just the current crisis, if you could just give the audience a sense of the larger U.S.-India relationship, right, which you've worked on for so many years. Not all of it was India-Pakistan crisis management. Give us a sense of where India fits into the larger picture.
Yeah. Well, I think, from the United States perspective, this crisis is very unhelpful to the U.S. sort of broader Indo-Pacific strategy because, part of that is developing the U.S.-India bilateral relationship, strengthening that, seeing India play a larger role in the Indo-Pacific region, looking east, developing relationships in Southeast Asia, contributing to maritime security in the Indian Ocean region, but even in the broader Indo-Pacific region. I think the U.S. really does see India playing an increasingly important geopolitical role throughout the Indo-Pacific region and as a counterweight to China. And even though India's economy is not near the level of China's, the militaries are very different in terms of military capabilities, but still India does have very strong military capabilities. I think it's rated the fourth most powerful military in the world by the Global Firepower Index. And certainly we want India to have those capabilities to stand up to China. And, looking at the India-China border crisis, it was helpful that India, was able to hold the line and was very patient in terms of the de-escalation of that crisis. India insisted that it would not go back to normalizing ties with China until China returned to pre-May 2020 military positions. And that's in fact what happened. And they have been able to disengage from positions and sort of de-escalate that situation to some degree. But I think that, for the U.S., India is extremely important, and the U.S. Wants to build that strategic partnership, not only for the sort of strategic, military aspects, but also on the economy and technology. You mentioned we were just at the Global Technology Summit, and it's clear that technology is going to be a key part of the growing U.S.-India relationship. It was a major area of focus during the Biden administration through the ISET initiative, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies. But I think we can see from Modi's visit to the White House to visit President Trump in February, the Trust Initiative, which is very similar to the ISET initiative. It's kind of a rebranding of that ISET initiative. But the U.S. is, hoping to work with India on things like AI and semiconductors, and, the fact that India has such extraordinary talent in this field in, technology, engineering. So there are many, many reasons why the U.S. is interested in building that strategic partnership with India. And unfortunately, this current crisis situation that India and Pakistan are in, takes India away from being able to move forward and focus on, developing its economy and, being engaged in the Indo-Pacific region in a broader way. Because obviously, when you're in a crisis situation, nothing is more important than, defending the country. And so India's being forced to, focus on the situation with Pakistan right now. But that's just where we are.
So let me open it up and take a couple of quick questions. Where do we have mics anywhere? The lady in pink, please keep your question in front over here. Do you have to go to a mic? What's the system over here? Do you have mics?
Mics,
Okay. Okay, there's a person, the person in blue, just one request, keep it short, keep it as a question. If you start delivering a lecture, I'll cut you short. Thank you.
Sure. So what can India do to recognize Somaliland or Taiwan? Trump has been working with Somaliland on getting a port to get some recognition. And also, India has about 142 embassies, but China has about 172. What can India do actually help have more embassies, more foreign missions? What's the geopolitical side on those two?
Okay, Tanvi, do you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, just very quickly, there's been a lot written about kind of the Indian Foreign Service needing to expand, but there are other ways. It's not just quantity, and I think you've seen some changes. The batches of Foreign Service officers have increased. There are other ways of doing this, bringing in more people through lateral entry. I mean, embassies are different. There have already been some open, for example, in the Baltics, some new embassies and other places in Latin America. But at the end of the day, there's going to have to be some creativity. Somebody like me, I'd be like, yes, in an ideal way, India needs to increase both its defense budget, but also its diplomacy budget as it becomes, a power that is operating many fields. I'll just very quickly say, these things, it's a chicken and egg thing. But even if you look at U.S. history, the U.S. didn't have all these things. Once its interest grew, then you start building up the system. So I think that'll be very natural. Just very quickly, I know nothing about Somaliland, I'm afraid. I will say on India-Taiwan, I do not think you're going to see, and I don't think the U.S. can get India to change its diplomatic position on kind of the status of Taiwan, what India has stopped doing long before the US, and now this Trump administration has started doing the similar thing, which is not reiterating its one China policy, but at the same time also deepening ties with Taiwan and pretty much across many domains. And so I think, what India is actually helping contribute to is letting Taiwan or making Taiwan feel less isolated. You're seeing a lot of activity there that sometimes gets lost in terms of the question of recognition or not, but also this question of what India will do in a Taiwan Strait contingency. There's a lot of interesting things happening on the economic, on the tech, on the people-to-people exchange side that's worth following.
Akriti.
Thanks, Sadanand, Lisa, and Tanvi. Great to see you. So I'm, I guess, going to ask a variation of the question that Sadanand asked. Sorry, I'm Akriti Vasudeva Kalyankar from the Stimson Center. So in some ways, this India-Pakistan crisis is different from before because there are both kinetic and non-kinetic measures that have been employed, which have short, medium, and long-term implications, right? So it's not just the sort of conventional tit-for-tat moves that are going on between India and Pakistan right now, but there's also India's holding in abeyance of the Indus Waters Treaty. There are economic measures we consider in terms of restricting trade. So it seems to be going in a direction which would consume Indian attention for a long period of time. How does New Delhi resist that temptation, or I guess withstand that pressure domestically to do more on the Pakistan side, but still, we're in a panel about India's expanding role on the world stage. How do you still focus on the broader region and your other relationships? Are there lessons here from like South Korea, which has a neighbor that also it has problems with, but is able to do more on the defense side, is able to do more with other partners?
And let's keep the answers quick so then we can get in one more question.
Yeah, I think it's going to be difficult, no doubt, like you said. But you raised an interesting point about South Korea. And of course, the United States works very closely with South Korea to deal with the North Korea challenge. Well, I wouldn't compare Pakistan to North Korea by any stretch. But I would say that probably India is going to be talking with its partners more about the terrorism problem. I think we're going to hear a lot more about terrorism, and that's going to become a part of the U.S.-India relationship. I mean, counterterrorism has always been there, but I think its prominence will go up, and also in venues like the Quad. I think India is going to make the counterterrorism issue much more prominent in those venues.
Is the lady over there, are you waiting for a question too? Go ahead.
Yes, I am. Hi, I'm Shalini from Johns Hopkins, and I'm just curious that, like Sadanand said, that India has a lot of problems to deal with on their own, and they would just want the Pakistan problem to just get rid of it. I'm just curious that whenever a terror attack happens, while we see on one side geopolitically everybody condemning those attacks, we also see that there is a retaliation when it comes. There are people, there are countries who are also saying, okay, act with restraint. So when we talk about, that ramp where we need to create the spotlight, what is the ramp countries are looking at? Is this a permanent solution where you think countries should just come out, talk about, condemn terrorism as a group? Or are we only looking for temporary solutions where, it's a tit for tat for some time, and then again there's some peace, and then again some war? So what is the permanent solution in terms of a global challenge?
You have 1 minute to solve the global terrorism problem, Lisa.
Okay. Well, I was thinking more about the India-Pakistan dispute, and I think the most helpful role that maybe the United States ever played when you're talking about sort of the Kashmir issue is former President Clinton, following the 1999 Kargil conflict. He talked about needing to respect the sanctity of the line of control, essentially implying it's a de facto border. And frankly, I think that's the only realistic solution to the problem. You're not going to change borders through blood. In this day and age, it's just not going to happen. So I think, the quicker that both countries accept that and operate on that basis, the more opportunity there will be to move forward. So that would be my response.
You want to add a sentence?
Just very quickly, two things. One, to Akriti, major powers have to walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think this is not about politics, so I do think, in the sense that I do think this Prime Minister can shape and affect the politics. I don't think that's going to cause that pressure. Second, very quickly on the question. You can't escape geography. This is something India has to deal with. But I do think there's a fundamental problem here that's not just India's problem. It's frankly the US's problem, it's the UK's problem, and it's the Pakistanis' problem as well, which is till folks in Rawalpindi decide that you cannot have the state sponsor and harbor and finance terrorism, it will blow back not just against American citizens, Indian citizens, British citizens, but Pakistani citizens at the end of the day, and prevent Pakistan itself from growing in a way it was growing sometimes faster than India. And as Sadanand has pointed out recently in his column, till as this thing is 2008, recently as 2008, Pakistan had a higher per capita GDP than India. Today, even not just India, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka are ahead of Pakistan. So, great book by Steve Cole called Directorate S, not actually about India, but about the US experience in Afghanistan after 9/11. He makes this point much better than I do. At the end of the day, if it is within, and I don't know that any of us can force Pakistan to make that decision. It has to be a Pakistani population asking their own intelligence services, what have they done for them lately in terms of their economy, rather than continuing to support these groups.
Well, on that note, I just want to thank our two wonderful speakers, and thank you very much.